Ronald the Rules Lawyer, and my coverage of the Pathfinder 2e remaster continues. It drops November 15. I call it an incremental new edition, version 2.1, and today I'm going to cover the Bard and the changes to that class. I also will give a basic overview to the people coming over to Pathfinder 2e for the first time, welcome, before I go into the changes. And also, while researching for this video, I found a new thing I don't like in the remaster, and I'm going to cover that during my closing statement. Also, for people concerned about my well-being and my unrealistic publishing schedule that I set for myself for the Pathfinder remaster, I've slowed down my original schedule, but it is still going to be a very rapid schedule because I do have a busier second half of the month in my other jobs. But yeah, the expressions of sympathy I've received from across the globe are appreciated. Before you forget, like and subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about the next videos in this remaster series, and also future videos that I will continue to be doing. And support my Patreon. I do volunteer legal work. This allows me to continue doing this channel. You get exclusive access to a number of videos I've done, including my 3.5-hour recording of me going through the Player Core and GM Core remaster books, and my continuing campaign running Pathfinder 2e for D&D YouTubers. That's for Tier 2 and above supporters. So on to the Bard, and first the basics of the Bard for newcomers to the system. Traditionally in D&D, the bards have been the jacks of all trades. They can do some fighting, they can do some magic, and they can also inspire and buff their allies through song and performance. D&D 5th edition made the decision to veer them towards being primary spellcasters and diminished their fighting role. Pathfinder 2e made that same decision, and they are full primary spellcasters, and in Pathfinder, there are 4 magical traditions. Casting spells gives you access to one of these spell lists, and any given spell appears on one or more of these spell lists. Bards get access to the Occult Magical Tradition, which, think of it as a combination of what a mind-tricking bard would get if you know previous fantasy games, and what a weird witch would get. It's basically those spells that affect the mind, deal with mysteries and investigation and undead and weird things in general. Also, there are 2 kinds of spellcasters in Pathfinder 2e. Prepared spellcasters who must predict how many times they'll cast each spell that day, and then when they cast a spell, they forget that spell, also known as traditional Vancian casting. And you also have spontaneous casters, which the Bard is. They get more flexibility with their spells. Here's the chart. They have a limited spell repertoire. The number of spells they know is equal to the number of spell slots that they have for that particular column, plus their bonus spells at level 1, which I'll get to in a sec. But as a spontaneous caster, they get to decide at the time of expending a spell slot which of the spells they know they are going to cast with it. However, unlike D&D 5th edition, they cannot decide to upcast or heighten a spell at will. That ability is limited to those spells that the Bard designates as their signature spells. They get to choose one spell at each spell level, now called spell ranks, that has that flexibility. Setting Bards apart from other classes that can cast occult spells is the fact that Bards can do composition spells. Composition magic is fueled by their performances, and performances can vary from music to dance to oratory and other things. Every bard starts with the composition cantrip, Courageous Anthem, formerly known as Inspire Courage, but there's a lot of name changes because of having to break from Wizards of the Coast's open gaming license. It's a cantrip, so they can do this at will, a single action to give the bard and all of their allies within 60 feet a bonus to their attack rolls, damage rolls, and saves against fear. And every bard also knows counter performance, a focus spell that costs a focus point. Bards start with a focus point pool of 1, and focus spells can be cast many times throughout the day, so long as they spend 10 minutes to recharge one of their focus points. And this is a reaction in response to an enemy trying to attack them with something that is visual, like a hypnotic pattern, or based on sound, like Wail of the Banshee. The bard responds with a performance, and every character in the party within the emanation has the option of using the bard's performance check instead of their own saving throw. They get to use the better of the two. Bards at level 1 also get a subclass, a muse. a being, a philosophy, or mystery that they're pursuing that inspires them to great deeds. Bards who have the Enigma Muse are seeking knowledge. They get the bardic lore feat that lets them recall knowledge on any topic. They can also gain abilities later that build on their ability to gain knowledge. The Maestro Muse is about art and performance. They excel in inspiring and buffing their allies and doing compositions in combat. From level 1, they have the ability to extend the duration of their compositions. The Polymath is the jack of all trades. They get to use their performance skill on more things, and they can gain abilities, including having their own occult spell book that give them some limited ability to change their spell repertoire from day to day. They excel in flexibility and versatility with their spells and their skills. The Bard who has a Warrior Muse is an inspiring warrior on the battlefield. They fight with their weapons, and like generals, they can inspire their allies to greater deeds, and also enable them to do things during the Bard's turn. As we see here, each Muse gives the Bard a level 1 Bard class feat. There are feats available only to Bards in this game, and an additional spell added to their spell repertoire. Class feats are the name of the game in Pathfinder. You're not just your class, you can also customize your class. Starting at level 2 and every even numbered level after, you get a class feat. And here's the list of class feats for bards in this book. There are 69 of them, which can look intimidating to the new player. Thankfully, there is one sample build in the book of a dancer bard. It suggests attributes, skills, a muse, and initial spells. Notably, some of these class feats require one of those 4 muses, but you're not limited to one muse in your barding career. There's a level 2 class feat called Multifarious Muse that lets you get an additional muse, and you can take this feat more than once, and it gives you the first level class feat that muse gives the bard. And of course, unlocks higher level feats that muse qualifies you for. Now that was our overview for new players. Now onto the changes to the bard in the remaster. First, changes to proficiencies. They are proficient with all martial weapons now. Previously, they were proficient with a few, I think 5 martial weapons that were either dexterity-based or one-handed weapons that were not the most exciting, but now they have access to the whole gamut of martial power. Compare this to the rogue, by the way, that also got technically the same buff of being proficient with all martial weapons. Rogues, however, because their sneak attack feature is so key to their damage, are, for all practical purposes, limited to those weapons that they can apply their sneak attack feature to. But bards don't have that restriction, and I think this is a little, maybe being slept on by the community. They can take meteor hammers, great axes, polearms, and fight just as well with them as with any other weapon. They have the ability to go big. And for newcomers, you can have both your hands full as a spellcaster in Pathfinder 2e. There's only a couple of exceptions that involve needing an interplanar locus. But you don't have to worry about having a free hand to cast spells in this game. And that's one of the changes in the remaster that is welcome, by the way. And is one less thing to worry about for the bard who wants to get in the mix and fight in combat. Another big change is that the bard's spell proficiency is with all spells, not just the occult spell list. Before, when you got access to another spell tradition via an archetype, you had to track a separate, often lower level of proficiency in that archetype spell tradition. Now you progress to legendary in all spells you have. And as a bard, because your main attribute is charisma, one of the attractive spellcasting archetypes is the sorcerer. The sorcerer is also a charisma caster, which, furthermore, can use any spellcasting tradition by virtue of its bloodline. This is in line with the idea of the bard just being very versatile and being able to eventually do anything. The last thing is that the bard now has a class DC. Class DC is a generic stat that abilities can refer to if there's no other stat to use. This is important because currently bards eventually get the ability to use critical specialization effects of weapons that they wield while they're doing a performance. And a number of those effects, like knocking somebody prone now, gives the target the chance to resist by checking against your class DC. By rule, currently, the bard was untrained in their class DC. So this is probably fixing an oversight from before, but it is a change that comes to us with the remaster. Okay, next let's look at the subclasses, the muses. Nothing has changed for the first 3. I do appreciate, though, the fuller description of each muse. Before they were, the descriptions were very sparse and I kind of didn't know what they were talking about. This kind of makes it fuller. The warrior muse has been buffed, but you won't see the buff here. It's actually in their free level 1 feat, Martial Performance. This had to be buffed first of all, because all it did before was give martial weapon proficiency to the bard. That obviously has been made redundant by the improved martial weapon proficiency. Now when you have Courageous Anthem active, whenever you damage an enemy with a strike, you extend the duration of your cantrip by 1 round. This can only happen once per casting. There are other similarly themed focus cantrips that the Warrior Muse Bard can get eventually that also have the same benefit. And remember, they're cantrips. You get to cast them over and over again. So if they can land hits consistently, they're giving this cantrip essentially a 2-round duration. I like how thematic this is. Of course, when you're striking blows that's inspiring to your allies, this clearly helps your action economy, which is important for a character who combines weapon fighting and spellcasting in a system where every action matters. So now we move on to the feats. And like with the other classes, we see all the feats from the core rulebook and the Advanced Player's Guide brought in this book. Some classes had some exceptions, but with the Bard, I actually found every single feat here. We get 2 new feats that I'll go over, and also I did a careful analysis comparing the current feats to what we see here, and there's a number of changes that I'll note as well. Martial Performance, we've already gone over the important change and buff there. We have a new feat called Emotional Push, obtainable at level 2. When an enemy fails their saving throw against an emotion spell, and this can be cast by any creature, including your allies, then that target is off guard to your next attack before the end of your next turn. There is no check, it works automatically. Of course, as a bard, you may be the one triggering this failed saving throw. You have your own personal little emotional combo. The next feat has a tiny change. It's the level 4 feat that warrior muses can get. When they use Courageous Anthem, they can prompt an ally to use their reaction to stride. The remaster adds the word an ally of your choice. Before it just said an ally, which made me laugh. Made me think they must have been thinking that there were arguments at tables when the bard would use this ability and people would argue, no, he inspired me! No, he inspired me! And this makes clear that the bard gets to choose and must choose when they use the ability. There's a few other feats that I won't go over that make this same change. Next is the feat at level 4 that lets the bard secretly cast a spell. It employs the new subtle trait that is introduced in the remaster. All spells now involve speaking and creating visual manifestations, like magical runes in the air. When a spell casting has the subtle trait, neither of those is necessary to cast the spell. This is a spell shape feat, formerly called metamagic, which needs to be done immediately before casting the spell, and it costs 1 action. This feat has been buffed. You can now do one of these things: create a diversion, demoralize, perform, or request as part of preparing this secret subtle spell. The spell must have one of these performance-themed traits, however, for it to be subtle. So you can secretly distract someone while casting Suggestion. So you can affect your target and debuff them. With Create a Diversion, you can even make yourself hidden and sneak away after doing something. There's probably other fun imaginative uses of this feat that I have not thought of. The next feat I want to look at is Fortissimo Composition. This used to be called Inspire Heroics. It gives you this focus spell that gives you a bigger numerical bonus to one of your composition cantrips, one of the listed ones. And the change here is purely editing. They added the Song of Strength composition, the one that lets you boost allies' athletics checks. The inclusion of that cantrip was in the Advanced Player's Guide. The connection between that and Inspire Heroics, you had to go to that cantrip to find it. Now it's in the base composition, a small thing. But I also just wanted to point out that Fortissimo is a much cooler name, and one of the things I'm happy changed. All right, next is Unusual Composition, which is changed. This is a spell shape action that you do right before a composition spell. What it does currently is, because every composition spell requires some kind of performance from the bard, some visual, some auditory, it wouldn't always affect all the targets. Let's say your allies are in a darkness spell and cannot see your dance moves. Well, unusual composition let you sing your dance moves essentially to them if you wanted to. You got to switch out the verbal and somatic components that were required for each composition spell then. Well, components are now not a thing. Compositions have the auditory or visual trait. What changes now is that your composition now affects every creature with any sense, and you get to exclude certain senses if you want to. So you're more able to make sure that you are going to affect those beings that you want to affect with your compositions. Note, you still, as before, still need to concentrate and do gestures in order to do this. So keep that in mind. Next, the level 12 feat Reverberate has been buffed, it looks like. It was a reaction that protected you or anyone in your party from a spell that did sonic damage. This now is not limited to spells. It's just any creature, and it doesn't limit what kind of attack that creature does. It could be a spell or a special ability, or a hazard that would deal sonic damage to you. You can react to all of those. Also, if the spell damage comes from a spell, you don't have to meet the caster's spell DC. There is the option also of needing to only meet their will DC, which may be lower. The GM resolves your performance check against the lower. So that's an improvement to that feat. Next is a small rules change. The earworm feat, the one where you sing something over and over again to your party for 10 minutes so that you can affect them with it in battle with a free action. It used to require that you do a performance check against a very hard level-based DC of the highest level ally, which, just hearing that, it sounded like a word salad and a complex thing to adjudicate. Well, now you just check against the highest will DC of the targets. This simplifies things. And also, I checked numerically whether this was now easier. I took the class that probably has the highest will DC at level 14, the Cleric, and saw that they have a DC of 37. Other classes will tend to be lower than 37. 37 was also the very hard standard level base DC of a 14th level party member. So this is a buff so long as you don't have a stubborn Cleric in your party. So that's it for changes to feats. These are very minor compared to what we've seen with some other classes, and I had to read pretty closely to find them. I do have a couple of comments, minor ones relatively, about some feats. First, level 14 feat, Triumphant Inspiration, available to the Warrior Muse. When they critically hit a foe with a melee weapon strike or unarmed attack, they can cast a composition cantrip as a free action. This all sounds good. This seems to build off of their new buffed level 1 feat that lets them extend the duration of their composition cantrip when they strike a foe. However, if they critically hit a foe and use this ability to cast a cantrip, that will end their current cantrip because you can only have one composition active at a time. This feat is unchanged from before, and it made sense before. The level 1 feat was buffed, but now it conflicts with it. At my tables, I would allow the bard to have a second composition cantrip active temporarily when this happens. Okay. Next is the Perfect Encore feat, a level 20 feat. It lets the bard have a second 10th rank spell slot. This is pure me being annoyed because it says prerequisite as Magnum Opus. This was true in the core rulebook as well. Magnum Opus is the 19th level class feature giving you a 10th rank spell slot. No one is getting this level 20 feat who doesn't already have this. And some people will be reading and scanning the level 20 feats and be thrown off by this prerequisite and not have heard of it before because who remembers the names of class features? And this is just going to cause some confusion. So it's a minor annoyance. I see no reason for that line to be there. Okay, on to focus spells, composition spells for the bard. What has changed? Virtually nothing. I found virtually no changes. The one thing I found was that the Song of Marching that helps the party hustle longer, travel more quickly over land, now lets the bard use their performance modifier for initiative and give a +1 status bonus to the party's initiative. A small buff, but probably appreciated for a focus cantrip that's only useful in some campaigns. Okay? We now move to Occult Spells, and if you haven't caught on, because the player core book has an emblematic spellcaster of each of the 4 spell traditions, I've used this occasion to give my coverage of changes to spells that I see. And with each tradition, and in this case it's the Occult tradition because it goes with the Bard, I focus on those spells that are thematic to that tradition. I'll start from cantrips and go up through the ranks. First, I want to discuss Detect Magic and Read Aura. Detect Magic and Read Aura are a duo of spells that help you detect magical things and identify their spell schools. Well, the 8 traditional magical schools are now eliminated in the remaster, so these spells had to be reworked. Detect Magic, this is our sonar ping, told you about the presence of magic within 30 feet when you cast it, and you can choose to exclude magic you're already aware of. Currently at 3rd rank, it tells you the school of magic of the highest level spell effect. If you heighten it further, you get to pinpoint the 5-foot cube it's in. This functions the same way, except you don't learn the school of magic, you learn the rank or level of the most powerful magical effect. This is very useful if you want to assess whether to try to counteract something with Dispel Magic. And you also learn right away whether you've stumbled upon some rock'em sock'em magic item, or sense that there's great power in this magical hazard. The Read Aura cantrip currently I don't find very useful. It takes a minute to cast, and it doesn't give you more information about a particular object than Detect Magic does. Its main use is that you could target many objects at once eventually, and that occasion usually doesn't arise. And so it's been buffed. It no longer tells you the School of Magic, which doesn't exist anymore. You get a +2 circumstance bonus to identify magic on the item. And I've GM'd enough to have seen characters critically fail their checks on identifying magic items. And so this is welcome to see. It gives them a cantrip that makes this quite less likely, if they have it prepared. So I welcome this change. Next is another cantrip. Currently, the only cantrip to make an illusion is to make a sound illusion with ghost sound. Figment adds the ability to create an illusory image. This can be used to create either. This is kind of like having the D&D 5th edition cantrip Minor Illusion and Ghost Sound together combined in a single cantrip. I can see a lot of creative uses for this cantrip by creative players. Also, it has a limitation, which is fine for a cantrip, where a visual illusion will look crude and undetailed if viewed from within 15 feet. It also gives the caster the option to create a diversion with this cantrip with a +2 circumstance bonus. That didn't exist before with Ghost Sound. So more utility, more flexibility, yay yay. Alright, next is the message cantrip. This is essentially unchanged. You get to silently voice a message up to somebody a distance away, and they hear it as if you were right next to them and speaking in a normal voice. What is remarkable is that this has the subtle trait. So it makes very clear now that you don't make any obvious visual manifestations or sounds when you cast this spell. But yeah, currently in the rules, it says spellcasting involves obvious visual manifestations, and this helps clarify that that's not true in this case, thanks to the new trait. I note, however, that the subtle trait is not on Figment, so you will want to somehow cloak the fact that you're creating this Figment if you're setting up some more elaborate ruse. The subtle spell comes up in other occult spells for obvious reasons, like Charm. So when you're trying to mind control somebody to be friendly to you, that has the subtle trait also. A nice clarification. Okay, next is Detect Alignment. Actually, no, it's not in this game because alignment's being removed. I'm actually showing you an image from the core rulebook, making a point in a dramatic way. And also not here is Undetectable Alignment. These spells are not necessary because alignment doesn't exist, which posed a problem for games of intrigue and mystery where you can just detect whether somebody's evil or not, which of course makes the undetectable alignment spell not necessary also. Okay, next is Runic Body. Currently, occult casters can cast Magic Weapon, but not Magic Fang to affect unarmed attacks. This corrects that problem. It's just a spell that existed already that's now available to occult spellcasters, and it makes sense. You can enchant body attacks just as well as you can weapon attacks. Next is the series of spells that remove afflictions and conditions. I went over these in detail in my video on the Remastered Cleric. This is the list of the current spells. They've been reorganized into 4 spells. They've been rebalanced, and they've also included more conditions that you can affect. But if you want to see in detail what changed, you'll need to see the Cleric video. I'll leave a link in the description. Next is See the Unseen. Currently, See Invisibility. This does the same thing. It lets you treat invisible creatures as concealed, but it has an additional effect. You can see incorporeal creatures, like ghosts, who are phased through an object if they are within 10 feet of the surface. So you can see a ghost hiding in the wall. Spooky. You also get a bonus, a +2 status bonus, to Disbelieve Illusions. So this spell has just been buffed. Next is Stupefy. This is currently known as Touch of Idiocy. This has just gotten a balance pass. Currently, on a critical failure, the target is Stupefied 4. That's been lowered to Stupefied 3. But also they've added a partial result if the target succeeds on their saving throw and does not critically succeed. They are Stupefied 1 until the start of your next turn. So here's an instance of them giving you a partial effect when they succeed against your spell. Next is Vision of Death, currently known as Phantasmal Killer. Currently, it is a very deadly spell. When the target critically fails their save, they have to make an additional Fortitude saving throw or die. That second save has the incapacitation trait, but it is very powerful. That additional effect has just been removed. However, the remainder of the effect is worse. Instead of 12d6 mental damage, it becomes 8d6 doubled, so more damage. And instead of fleeing until the end of their next turn, they're fleeing so long as they're frightened, so that likely will be 4 rounds. Also, of course, the spell still has the death trait, so it can still instantly kill a creature who's brought down to 0. So I don't know if this was a nerf against monsters. The main story is that there is no incapacitation trait, and it takes them out of the battle for 4 rounds. Well, actually more than that, because they have to run back after they ran away for 4 rounds. Meanwhile, the danger of this instantly killing a party member has been reduced, because remember, it still has the death trait. If you're brought down to 0 hit points, you die. And actually, dying from loss of hit points is increased now because of the greater damage on a critical failure. So I'm going back and forth. But what I was going to say was what often happened was a high rank version of this spell of Phantasmal Killer would instantly kill a party member. And the incapacitation trait didn't really protect the party member against a higher rank spell. Instead, that party member is more likely to be exposed to this being taken out of the battle for quite a while, which is a softer blow. And hopefully someone in the party took one of those condition removing spells in order to help them out. Okay, next is Slither. This is our new Black Tentacles, and also a much cooler name and theme. It doesn't work exactly the same. Before, in an area, tentacles would come out and do bludgeoning damage and grapple you. Now it's a mass of shadow snakes that do piercing damage. They're biting you. And they can also do persistent poison damage. That's new. Persistent damage. Instead of making a spell attack roll against Fortitude DCs, every creature in the area does a reflex saving throw. So it's their reflex, not their fortitude, that matters now. They can still be grabbed or restrained depending on the result. Before, Black Tentacles did bludgeoning damage only if a creature ended their turn in the area, which was kind of a weird trigger. Now it's just persistent poison damage, which is more consistent with how persistent damage works in the system. So that's a welcome streamlining. And it's poison damage instead of bludgeoning, of course. Next is not news to people who've been following my series. Dragons can be summoned within any spellcasting tradition now, and also you can turn into a dragon. This is because in the lore of the remaster, dragons are now tied to the 4 magical traditions, instead of the old division of good metallic dragons and evil chromatic dragons, because alignment's gone. Next is Cursed Metamorphosis. This is Baleful Polymorph renamed. Strangely, before it was not an occult spell, which was definitely a mistake. Witches should be able to turn people into frogs, so that error has been corrected. Next is Nevermind. This is Feeble Mind, and actually, it's the same. I just included this because I like the new name, Nevermind. Oh, and I want to point out, a number of curse spells say this now. The effects of this curse can be removed only through effects that target curses, which is welcome because currently you can kind of negate the effect of a curse the way that conditions can be reduced or removed through spells. Curses working this way retains the intent of having them being permanent debilitations. Next is Quandary, our new version of Maze. Instead of being in a maze in another dimension, you're in a puzzle room, you're in an escape room, and they have to use occultism, perception, or thievery to get out, instead of perception or survival. Otherwise, it works the same way as Maze. And our last spell is Phantasmagoria. Currently, the spell Weird. This was like Phantasmal Killer on steroids. And like our new version of Phantasmal Killer, Our new version of Weird also removes the second saving throw that can kill the target. It does the same mental damage along all degrees of success, but whereas before, Weird did similar effects as Phantasmal Killer, it made you frightened and potentially flee, this has different effects. If they succeed, they cannot use reactions until the start of your next turn. If they fail, they are confused until the start of your next turn. And if they critically fail, they are confused for 1 minute. Wow. So instead of just numbered debuffs, we have them losing control, which I don't know if it's buffed or nerfed. I'll let you all fight it out in the comments. But it's nice to have more diversity between similar spells. Of course, this one affects any number of creatures within 120 feet, thus justifying its high rank. Before my closing statement, I just want to make a couple last comments. First, Ventriloquism is a spell, and here in the remaster, it does not have the subtle trait. I think it should have the subtle trait. It's ventriloquism. The whole point is to look like you're not doing what you're doing. Anyway, and lastly, I am unhappy that the Bon Mot skill feat is not in this book. I'm showing you an image from the Advanced Player's Guide. It's such a fun thematic feat, and it gives a combat use for diplomacy, which otherwise is not useful in combat. And this is the book that has the Bard. And it's a great way to set up mental attacks, which I think should be in the initial core book. It helps casters, basically. Okay, on to my closing statement. First, on the Bard, there are no big dramatic changes here. We basically see tweaks to feats and spells. We have a lot of rebalancing and reworking of occult spells that I like. The main news is that we have a return of the Battle Bard. The Warrior Muse got a significant buff, actually more the return of the Bard holding their own with weapons. Because what we see accompanying that also is this concept of the Bard being a battle leader, reminiscent of the Skald class, I think, in 1st edition Pathfinder. Now, these ideas were expressed before in the Warrior Muse and its accompanying feats in the Advanced Player's Guide, but these tweaks have made it a really viable and fun-sounding concept. So, in rules-lawyer fashion, we end with a little rant. In the lead-up to the remaster, the designers talked about the removal of spell components. There's a very good reason to remove verbal, somatic, focus, and manipulate components from spellcasting, and the designers listed them here. What many people encountered was that there were many traits hidden inside those components that had important game effect. So the remaster removes those spellcasting components and instead puts a lot of the relevant traits into the given spell, which makes perfect sense. So you'll know right away that this spell has the manipulate trait and so therefore will provoke a reactive strike. However, I think the removal of verbal and somatic components lost some clarity that was unnecessary. And I don't think that the change should be reversed at all. I just think it created some problems that can be fixed easily. And I encountered those problems when preparing for this video. It basically came to a head when, in this tour through the classes, I stumbled upon a class that relies on targets perceiving the bard's performance in order to be affected by it. So I'm going to walk through what I found. I found, and I talked about this feat earlier, the feat Unusual Composition. It says that if your next action is to cast a composition spell that is auditory or visual, you can have it affect creatures who can witness it with any sense. Okay, that sounds straightforward. Some performances will have sound, others will be visual. Under the current rules, it's clear whether a performance is auditory or visual. Here's the composition trait from the core rulebook. It says, to cast a composition cantrip or focus spell, you use a type of performance. If the spell includes a verbal component, you must use an auditory performance, and if it includes a somatic component, you must use a visual one. The spell gains all the traits of the performance you used. And before, we were happy. We had cantrips like Inspire Courage, where it said very clearly it had the verbal action, and we knew, therefore, it had an auditory performance. And that cohered with what was in the text. You inspired allies with words and tunes. Similarly, the House of Imaginary Walls required miming, and so that was a visual effect. It only affected creatures who could see it. All right, so what does the composition trait now say, now that we don't have verbal or somatic components? This is what it says. You use a performance, just like before. Then it says, if the spell requires an auditory performance, you might recite a poem, sing a song, or perform a dramatic monologue. If the spell requires a visual performance, you might dance or pantomime. Also, our level 10 feat refers to whether a spell is auditory or visual. Now, this works when the spell tells us whether it's auditory or visual, like counter performance. However, nearly all the composition cantrips don't say whether they're visual or auditory now. Now, sometimes you can surmise from the description, like with Courageous Anthem. It's called Anthem, and it says in the text, you inspire yourself and your allies with words or tunes. And we also know from what we saw earlier, from the earlier version of the spell, Inspire Courage, that this involves making sounds, and so therefore it should have the auditory trait. However, the auditory trait is not on the spell. And we have some focus spells where it's not really clear what's going on. Allegro. This one gives an ally an extra action to strike, stride, or step. It just says you perform rapidly, speeding up your ally. You can talk really fast, or you can dance really fast. Now, those of us who are in the know can look at these traits and see that it has the concentrate trait and not the manipulate trait. And because we know the history of these traits, not because of anything in the remaster itself, we know that this originated from a spell that had only a verbal component. And from that, we derive that it has the auditory trait. We've gone from traits being nested, having to cross-reference to find out what traits actually are involved with the spell, to traits being missing. Here's another example, Soothing Ballad. The text says you draw upon your muse to soothe your allies. It doesn't say how. However, we can guess from the concentrate trait and manipulate trait that it has, or had, the verbal and somatic components. However, many people will just read the name and think, ballad. This is someone singing to their party. This is a auditory performance. And of course, under the Pathfinder Society or organized play rules, this replaces the old text. The old version of Soothing Ballad is gone, or it's not going to be legal at least, in official organized play, which is going to create problems if that is followed strictly. Now, some might say that the intention of the remaster, this definitely is true with how spellcasting is described under the classes, that it's up to the GM and the players to work out what you're actually doing. You might be playing an instrument, you might be tracing out sigils in the air, and look at the language of the performance skill currently. And remember, the composition trait says you do a performance, capital P, and point to the fact that there's a table here assigning different traits to different performance types. Maybe it's the choice of the caster, what kind of performance they want to do. However, if we went with that interpretation, you get to do whatever performance you want to do. And by the way, I wouldn't object to that. It would be cool to be able to inspire your allies with breakdancing. I'm not against that. But if we went with that interpretation, then what's the point of the unusual composition feat, the purpose of which was to be able to affect any creature you want, regardless of the traits of your composition? That is supposed to require this feat to do. So what needs to be done? Well, first, on Paizo's end, they just need to add the auditory and visual traits where they belong. I think they just replaced the verbal component for Courageous Anthem with the concentrate trait and didn't think of what this meant for composition spells. And the rules clarity we need to know. Deafened allies should not be able to benefit from Courageous Anthem. So yeah, we need an errata to errata the errata which the remaster is. Which I have to say is a better way to treat your rule system than to have a bad rule that has an obvious needed fix that you don't change for 9 years. But it's still annoying, and I think something that should be done. So what do we do for now? Well, in the case of some spells like Courageous Anthem, it's kind of obvious that from the name and from the description that you are doing a auditory, singing, or speaking performance. In fact, nearly all of the compositions involve some vocal performance, like Fatal Aria. And if a particular spell is unclear, we look for the concentrate and manipulate traits. If it is concentrate, then it is auditory. If it has the manipulate trait, it involves gestures and is visual. So we have a new nested trait problem, but this time confined to composition spells. One more issue that came up from the removal of spell components. Here is the composition spell House of Imaginary Walls. It has the visual trait, so someone needs to clearly see you miming for them to be affected by this invisible solid wall. But I realized, since the remaster says that spell casting by default involves speaking, and as well as visual manifestations, and that silencing a caster with magic, let's say, will prevent them from spellcasting, I wondered, how does this affect this spell, which clearly involves only miming? Well, it looks like the silence spell will stop this. And I think that's okay. I don't know if this is a problem. This seems to be a weird corner case, and hopefully there are not other spells that are like this, but I enjoy the simplicity of not having to worry about whether something has to be spoken or not, and that the silence spell will have a uniform effect on all casters. At least that's my current position. So that concludes my video on the Bard, and my tour of the remaster continues. If you've enjoyed the coverage, like, subscribe, and also ring the bell to be notified of the next video when it goes public. Also, join my Discord. We are at 4,500 people now, I believe. People discuss Pathfinder 2e and other gaming. It's also a chance to play Pathfinder since we have a drop-in organized play system. Also, support my Patreon. It allows me to continue this channel. And you get exclusive access to videos, including my 3.5-hour video going through the remaster books, and for tier 2 and above supporters, my campaign running Pathfinder with D&D YouTubers. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video. I have been Ronald, the Rules Lawyer, and I'll see you next time.